I want to continue on with our scripture reading this morning, 1 Samuel chapter 17, and I'll be reading from verses 38 to 50. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with sword and with spear and with javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with spear and sword, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Well, some of the time period is different for us to catch our minds around and our hearts around. And some of the culture is very different than what we experience and look at today. But there are still some important truths and lessons that we find throughout these stories that God wants to speak to us out of in the Old Testament. Those of you who have been here the last number of weeks, you've seen that we have been exploring the story of David in the Old Testament. And we have seen that David was described as a man after God's own heart. And so the question we've been looking at is, what kind of heart does the Lord seek within us? And it's the reason we're looking at the story of David. If David was a man after God's own heart, then perhaps his story has some answers for us on the kind of heart that the Lord seeks. We have spent a few weeks looking at King Saul, the first king of Israel, and introducing David through that and looking at the tragedy of image or appearance over substance. What happens when we make the way something looks more important than the substance of what it truly is? And we heard God's word to Samuel last week when the Lord said to Samuel, For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And the Lord was looking for a man after his own heart. I asked the question last Sunday, in what ways do we see differently than God? In what ways do we see differently, particularly from the secular? And when I use the word secular, it's not a bad word. The word itself, secular, means without God. And so we can look at life through the eyes of the secular, what it is to look at life without God, or we can look at eyes through God. In what ways do we see things differently than God sees it? Because the question is not about our ability, but it's about God's ability and the kind of heart that God brings his ability to bear through. And the answer to that question continues with the passage that we're looking at today. Today we are in one of the most well-known Bible stories and battle stories of all time. There are few people that haven't heard of the story of David and Goliath. David and Goliath, a story that is synonymous with great but unlikely victories of the little guy over impossible odds. We see David's speech, and he says, as he says in verse 47, he says that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And his powerful speech that he has before he goes on to the battlefield is followed by the words in Scripture that says, David ran quickly to the battle line. Now, we already know the results. We know the end of the story. David wins. David wins, and Goliath is defeated. But for me, when I look at this story, and whenever I've looked at this story of David and Goliath, it isn't the battle on the field. It isn't the story of David and Goliath that most intrigues me about this chapter, about what God has to teach in 1 Samuel 17. Rather, to me, the most important part of the story is what happens before. I've been doing long-distance running for a while, and when I'm training for a race and I plan to go for a difficult run, or I'm struggling with motivation, it's kind of like tomorrow morning I'm going to go for this long run. I don't know what the weather is going to be like. Once I'm out the door, the run is done. Once I'm out the door, the run is done. I'm just putting in time. The challenge I find is getting to the door and getting out the door. And for that, I have to prepare the night before. I have to look at what I'm eating the night before. I have to get my gear all out. If my gear is all out, then that helps. Otherwise, I roll over in bed with all kinds of excuses that prevent me from ever getting out the door in the first place. That is part of the story that I see with David here, the challenge of getting out the door. An ancient military strategist who wrote the book, The Art of War, during the 5th century BC, said this: every battle is won before it is ever fought. Now, I'm not sure if that's a universal truth or not, but I get the point. I get the point. When we read 1 Samuel 17, we enter into a story in which if David had handled certain things differently, he never would have walked out on the field in the first place. And that's what I want to look at this morning. The obstacles to facing a giant. Because there were voices and there were messages that David had to come to terms with. That if he had handled them differently, he would have never faced Goliath. He would have never got on the field, and we would never have known the name and this story. How do we recognize the obstacles to facing some of the giants that may be in our life? Stuff that God calls us into that require both faith and courage. How do we recognize and how do we respond to obstacles that keep us in the way of getting on with God? Well, I want to look and talk a little bit about David, what we know about him so far. As I said, as we've looked at him so far, we know God is seeking a man after his own heart. And God is still seeking men and women and young people after his own heart. And he chooses this young man, barely a young man. He's perhaps a boy. When we looked at his anointing last Sunday, it ranged, he could have been between 12 to 16 years of age. It would be several years after last week's anointing before he would be confronting Goliath, and it would be even longer, a good 10 years yet, before the anointing of him as king would be realized and he would take the crown. God chooses David, this young man, almost a boy. He's the youngest of 8 brothers. And I'm wondering how much was present, how much God had to deal with, work with to begin with, versus what he foresaw David would become. Couldn't help but think of the verse in the New Testament in Romans 8:29, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined. That our God knew the heart of David and planned for this for David. David was this young man. He was anointed to be the next king of Israel. And what happened immediately after that? He's anointed in front of his brothers, in the midst of his brothers who were overlooked by the prophet Samuel. The thing that he does next is he returns to the shepherd's field. He returns to the shepherd's field. This says something really about this young man. He's a young man of courage that takes responsibility given to him seriously, and he was a young man that served faithfully in the forgotten places. When he was brought forward to be anointed, even his father didn't, you know what, let's bring the heavy guns forward. Let's bring the real sons forward. David, we're just going to leave him in the field. Surely God's not interested in him. And yet one by one, we see it differently. What do we know about David? David is a young man of courage that takes a responsibility given to him seriously. I like what he says here to Saul in the midst of this story in verse 34 to 36. He said, "But David said to Saul, 'Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took the lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose again against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him.'" Okay, don't rush over that too quickly, okay? I mean, I have seen lions in a cage at the zoo. I've bumped into a few bears in life. I remember we were kids at Fort McMurray, the forests around the Athabasca River. They were my playground growing up. And I remember one occasion when we were just kids and we had our bikes going down a trail. We left it, went exploring in the bush. We came out at a different spot on the trail, came up to found our bikes. There was this big black bear sitting there sniffing our bikes. Now, we did exactly what we had been taught to do. We yelled really loud and ran as fast as we could up the hill. Fortunately, the bear was more interested in our bikes than he was us. Motocross came down and the noise, I guess, scared the bike away. We went back down to find our bikes later and the bear was gone and we rode away. But seen a few bears. A few of you have seen a few bears. But I tell you, if I was looking after a bunch of sheep and a lion came and had the sheep in his mouth and was running away, I'd be more likely to ask him what kind of sauce he wants with that. Think of David here. He chased after. He had a responsibility to vulnerable sheep that were put in his care, and he took it seriously. I mean, I can't quite imagine grabbing a lion by its beard and pulling it down and striking it dead. But that's what David did. That's what David did. And maybe, as I was thinking about, this isn't quite where I want to go this morning, but maybe there's something about that kind of heart that resonates with the heart of the Lord Jesus. The heart of the Lord Jesus himself, who said, "I am the good shepherd." I am the good shepherd, Jesus says of himself. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He who is a hired hand and not the shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. David was a young man who was faithful in the forgotten places, who took the responsibility that were given to him seriously. That says something, I believe, about the kind of heart that God seeks. He's anointed by Samuel as the next king over his brothers, and then he returns to the field. 1 Samuel 17. Enter Goliath, introducing Goliath. We start in verse 1, and once again we see the Israelites facing off against the Philistines. The Philistines and the Israelites, they each are on different sides of different mountain areas, and there's this valley in between them. Verse 4 to 10 gives this intimidating description of the champion and his proposed context. There's a lot of verses that are given over to describing Goliath. And as you read the passage, we're supposed to be intimidated by what we see, by what's described to us. He's described as being really tall, really big, being very experienced as a soldier, having on all this armor. His spear alone weighed over 15 pounds. We're supposed to be intimidated as we read the description in verse 4 to 10. Then we come to verse 11 and we see the result. We see this in verse 11 where it says, when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now remember, if you have been with me for the last few sermons, when we looked at the people demanding a king, they didn't want God to rule the same way over them. This was the people of God talking. They wanted a king so that they would be like everyone else. And the passage that we read, the verse it said, so be like everyone else, and that the king would go out for us, and the king would fight our battles for us. They didn't want God to fight their battles quite the same way. They wanted the king to do it. Well, here was their king. Here was Saul. And what was he doing? He was with the rest of them, dismayed and greatly afraid. Saul should have been the one leading the way. Saul should have been the one leading the people of God and leading the people of God into faith and faithfulness to God in the midst of the challenge that was in front of them. But Saul's life, even though he remains king for at least another 10 or 12 years in the story in the Old Testament, his life spirals. His life spirals. We didn't read the passage, but he's inflicted by this evil spirit. He goes into all kinds of different experiences with that, his moods, his anger, and such. We read his life just spirals. He actually, he doesn't know who David is yet, although he's heard David. Because they decided in the king's court with Saul, with what he was experiencing, they thought music would soothe him. And somebody knew of this guy named David, one of Jesse's sons, and they brought him to play for Saul, and it soothed Saul when he went into these episodes. Now, Saul didn't really know who David was, but that was kind of the first introductions that took place. Look at verse 16. Look at verse 16 and what it says. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. For 40 days, Goliath taunted and left them running away, dismayed and in fear. Dear people, what happens when fear is magnified by time? What happens when fear is magnified by time? We make ourselves victims of intimidation. What happens when fear is magnified by time? We become victims of intimidation. We make ourselves victims of intimidation. Obstacles to facing a giant. Obstacle number one this morning is the obstacle of intimidation. There's a reason that Saul never went into the field. The reason that Saul never went into the field is he was not able to overcome the obstacle of intimidation. Was David intimidated by Goliath? Well, he sure should have been from any normal point of view. But we read verse 37. David says to Saul, the Lord who delivered me will deliver me. If you look at the passage, we see something about the heart of David and how he responds to intimidation. Goliath was this obstacle that was big and scary. You might have some of those in your life these days. You might have some places that God's trying to pull you into, and it's too scary. How do we deal with the obstacle of intimidation? David said this, verse 37, the Lord who delivered me will deliver me. He was able to look upon past experiences with God. If God did this in the past, God can do this in the present. God can do this in the future. He was able to recall to mind. That's why throughout the scriptures you see occasions where God acts on behalf of the people, and they are called to put some kind of marker. Sometimes it's stones that were gathered. Sometimes it was an altar. Different kind of markers to remind them of the thing that God had done in that season. Why was that there? It was to remind them for future faithfulness. The God who did is the God who will do. And David knew, how did he face the obstacle of intimidation? The Lord who delivered me will deliver me. Verse 45, we read this. David says this, "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts." Am I big enough? Am I strong enough? Nope. We'll get to that in a minute. How did David face the obstacle of intimidation? I come to you in the name of the Lord of God of Israel. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Verse 46, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David's heart also recognized there was something bigger than him that was happening in the moment. Verse 47, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, not with the weapons and strategies and means of the world. The Lord doesn't save with the weapons and strategies and means of this world, the expected requirements to overcome the obstacle. And in our culture, in our mindset, what is that? Might overcomes might. Might overcomes might. And we look within ourselves to say, we need to have the ability, we need to overcome. When the people of God were getting ready to cross the Red Sea, and it was a scary, intimidating thing, the word of the Lord to Moses was, stand still, for the Lord will fight for you. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we're supposed to do. But the posture of our heart is, it's not about me, and it's not up to me. And that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. This is the same David who would write the Psalms, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? How did David face the obstacle of intimidation? By focusing on the character and the ability of God. Too often we look at our ability, our resources when it comes to Goliath. David focused on the character and the ability of God. It was faith in God that would lead David to be able to write, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. See, something that David, I believe he repeatedly learned, is that there is only one giant in the land, and it isn't Goliath. What David learned, what David could declare, is there is only one giant in the land, and it isn't Goliath. Pastor Charles Swindoll writes of this account and says, what giant? The only giant in my life is God. The only giant in my life is God. I think I've shared the story before about the lady that goes to her pastor and says to their pastor, is it okay if I pray about little things to God? Like, is it okay, like some of these little inconsequential, should I pray about these little things to God? And the pastor's response to this dear lady was this, is anything in your life big to God? Is anything in your life big to God? David learned repeatedly, there's only one giant in the land, and it isn't Goliath. The only giant in his life was God. Dear people, what is in front of you these days that God would want you to face, but you are experiencing intimidation? You are intimidated by it. Is there some venture, some new venture that God is moving you towards, but intimidation has your feet stuck in the mud because you're afraid of the change or the loss of where that decision might lead you? Or maybe it's the opposite extreme. Maybe God wants you to stay put in a difficult situation or with something that you're struggling to be motivated with, but you can't see how, and you're looking to run the other way. Maybe your marriage is a challenge and you see no prospect of change. Maybe you're facing a debilitating addiction that intimidates you and you can't see it being beat. Maybe God is calling you to confront some kind of sin in your life that dishonors Him, but it is so hard to let it go. Maybe you are struggling with health issues that God has yet to deliver you from, and the future is intimidating. Maybe, like Moses, God wants you to take up the mantle of something, a mantle perhaps of a new ministry. And you're saying, not me, Lord. I can't. I'm slow of speech. Let me ask you this morning, is that which intimidates you bigger than God? This is basic Sunday school stuff, but this is what we challenge. We try to sophisticate it. We try to make the challenge in front of us so much bigger than it really is. It really comes down to the question of faith. What do I believe about the character of God? What do I believe about the ability of God? Is that which intimidates you bigger than God? We need to come to terms, dear people, with what we believe about our God. David would never have entered the field. He never would have confronted Goliath unless he came to terms with the obstacle of intimidation by seeing his faith and his courage rooted in the character of God and calling to mind God's faithfulness to him in the past. The Lord who delivered me will deliver. The battle belongs to the Lord. Do you need to come to terms with the obstacle of intimidation in your life? The only giant in my life is God. Are you afraid of something God is calling you to engage in? Does it lead you to act out of intimidation or fear or out of faith? The only giant in my life is God. Obstacle number 2. There are a number of things that David had to face that if he had responded to these obstacles differently, he never would have got out in the field in the first place. First one is the obstacle of intimidation. The second one this morning is the obstacle of criticism. The obstacle of criticism. Take a look in your passage in 1 Samuel 17 at verses 28 and 29. Now, Eliab was the eldest brother, the eldest of the 8 sons of Jesse. Eliab was the first one presented to Samuel, where Samuel said, surely this must be God's chosen one to be the next king of Israel. And God told Samuel, nope, not him. And he went through all the brothers till he came to David. Well, now here, these 3 oldest brothers are with Saul at this battle. The 3 brothers are part of the group that with Saul is running away dismayed and fearful. David arrives on the scene. David begins asking questions like, what's this? Why are we running away? And his brother, remember, his brother has been offended. Right? This is the older brother who has been offended at the fact that he wasn't the one chosen. I heard a great line this week. I was at a district workshop this week, and one of our district guys made this statement. He said, "Just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right." I really like that. Just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. Eliab was offended. He says this, now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, why have you come down, and with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done? Was it not but a word? This is the obstacle of criticism. How David handled this encounter with his brother made the difference between whether he ended up on that field with Goliath or not, right? His brother criticized his character, criticized his motives. That was his brother's response to his offense. Now again, just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. Just because Eliab said it, just because he said this criticism doesn't mean he was right. But how do you respond to the obstacle of criticism? God is moving you here, but when criticism hits, how do you respond to it? I think I've shared the story before, but I'll share it again. It was a story told to me by the president of the Bible college that I went to train to be a minister. And I remember he and I were sitting down and visiting one day, and he told me the story about the first time his motives in ministry were questioned and how angry he felt about it. You know, it didn't matter. The question wasn't whether or not what he did was wise or right, but the question was about his motives. And he shared with me the first time his motives were put into question and how angry he felt. And then he shared with me how a number of years later, he found out that how he handled that criticism was a ministry to other people. He said there were other people who watched him that knew the criticisms weren't true, that knew the story, the criticisms of his motives weren't true. They watched him, and they later, it was several years later, said to him, "This spoke to me, the way you responded to this season of criticism and question motives." And this Bible college president, he shared with me, he was so glad that he had checked his natural impulses during that season. This was told to me before I ever became a pastor, and it was so meaningful to me. I mean, over 25 years of ministry, I've had my shares of criticisms, some of them definitely warranted. But when someone misrepresents you, and you've experienced that before, right? You've done something, and whether it was the right thing or the wise thing or not, somebody has questioned the reason why. One of the big reasons there are conflicts in marriages is because we don't focus on what a person has done and the effect. Rather, we make comments on who they are as a person. And so then we get our backs up. It's no longer about the issue of what we've done. It's about who we are. And when who we are is threatened by other people, when somebody else decides what the narrative is about who we are, that's a very intimidating, that's a very threatening, it's a very frustrating experience. And there are many marriages that struggle because the language they use in their conflicts doesn't deal with the issues and the effect. You see, I'm able to say what you did and what you said and the effect that it had on me and the effect that I perceive it had on others. What I'm not equipped to do is tell you why you did it. What I'm not equipped to do is tell you why you did something, because only God can discern the thoughts and intents of the heart. You can speculate, you might even be right. But there are many conflicts and there are many wars that are waged over trying to protect the narrative of what we believe is true about the motives and character of our life when somebody attacks it. This is what David was experiencing here. What do I do when somebody misrepresents me? And it affects your reputation. It is difficult at times to release your reputation into the hands of God. But that is what one must do. God, can I trust you with my reputation when I can't change the false narrative that's being said about me? This was David's story. This is where David was at. I want you to look at what David did. Look at verse 30. And he turned away from him toward another. How did David handle the criticism? He could have got embroiled into the conflict. He could have got embroiled into the conflict with his brother. He could have tried to defend his reputation, fix things. Instead, the issue before them was Goliath. And how did he respond to the obstacle of criticism? He turned away from him. He turned away from the criticism towards another. Now, I'm not saying that again, you need some context here. Sometimes when criticism comes your way, it's warranted. Sometimes there are some things where you need to do some introspection. Sometimes you need to come before God and say, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there's any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Don't dismiss criticism quickly without going to God first and saying, "Lord, is there something that I need to see in this?" But in this case, David turned away from it towards another. David understood there was a greater issue in the moment, an issue that reflected on more than just himself and his reputation, and he refused to become entangled in the lesser battle. David refused to become entangled in the lesser matter, discerning between the Goliaths that need to be confronted and the smaller battles that need to be turned away from is vitally important in our Christian life. The issue with his brother's insult was only about him. The issue with Goliath was about God's honor and God's reputation. If David, the obstacle of criticism, if David had gotten sidetracked with his brother's criticisms, with his brother's attacks on his character, he would never have made it into the field. Sometimes the way we handle criticism, that can be the obstacle that takes us out. What do you do with criticisms? Turn away from it? How do you go on? How do we go on with God's activity in the moment that we are in? Can I entrust my reputation to God and move forward and get on with God's activity? Obstacle number 3. There's 4 of them. Obstacle number 3 is the obstacle of questionability. Look at verse 33 in the passage here. Look at what he hears from Saul. Verse 33, and Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. This is the obstacle of questionability. And so many of us live with that voice in the back of our mind. Sometimes it's from where we've grown up. Sometimes it's significant people that we feel have written us off in the moment. But what do? The obstacle of questionability. David, you are only, and you are not able. Where did David's confidence come from? Well, it certainly didn't come from home. I mean, his father left him in the field and didn't count him as one that could have been considered. His brothers were offended at him. They weren't thinking that he was the one. They weren't thinking he had anything to contribute into this moment. Where did David's confidence come from? How do you answer this when somebody looks at you and says, you're not able, you are only? Let me tell you how you answer it. The response is this: you are right. You are right. I am only, and I am not able. For those who are familiar with the 12-step program, that's the first step to change, is coming to the place where we recognize that we are powerless and we need something or someone that's greater than ourselves. How do you deal with the obstacle of questionability? You are only, you are not able. To begin with, you say, you're right. Of course I'm not able. But look at David's response. Again, I've already read the verses. He says, the Lord who delivered me will deliver, for the battle is the Lord's. How do you deal with the obstacle of questionability when you hear it from others or you're saying it to yourself? I'm not able. I'm not enough. Remember the old Sunday school song? My God is so big, so strong, and so mighty, there's nothing my God cannot do. Again, it comes back to what we said earlier. It is about our faith in God, not our faith in our own abilities. Which do you find yourself living life and acting upon? Which do you find yourself living life and acting upon? Dear people, when your ability is questioned, you can readily agree. But when we see the issues in terms of God, then it's not about our ability, it's about God's ability. And that's what last week was about. What happens? The tragedy of appearances over substance. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Dear people, do you believe that God will meet your weakness with His might? Now, it might not look like power the way the world looks at power. But there's a difference between power and influence. Influence is real power. There are many people that can have might, but they don't have the ability to influence a heart. There's a difference between the might and power of this world and the influence that comes through our faithfulness to God. Do you believe that God will meet your weakness with his might? Do you believe that when you take a step in God's direction, he will infuse you with his ability? If you do, then step forward. Get onto the field. Get onto the field of God's activity. Do not listen to the obstacles that question your ability when you are confident in God's calling. Don't get sidetracked with your ability. And as a consequence, never step onto the field. Last one, obstacle number 4. We've looked at 3. The obstacle of intimidation, the obstacle of questionability, the obstacle of criticism, and our last one is the obstacle of you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. You ever have that? You're trying to do something and somebody kind of, you're doing it wrong, and it's kind of like, okay, I'm done. The obstacle of you're doing it wrong. Really, this is just another form the obstacle of criticism takes. Verse 38 to 40, we read about David's discussion with Saul. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head, put all this armor on, and Saul, this is how you need to do this. And David's response was, I cannot go in these. I can't do it. This isn't going to work. The obstacle of you're doing it wrong. David knew it wasn't going to work to wear Saul's armor. David knew it wasn't going to work to wear Saul's armor. He couldn't enter the battle as Saul. And so much of what God was doing in David's life was to train him not to be another Saul. Now, understand, it's not that we can't learn from others. It's not that we can't develop our skills. It's not like this was the first time David had ever used a slingshot and a rock. I mean, he spent many hours in the shepherd's field. I'm sure it was a skill that he had honed. But David was not going to be able to go into the field as Saul. He wasn't going to be able to do the work in Saul's armor. See, we need to face the giants as who we are in Christ, with the gifts and resources that the Spirit of God has given us, and not as someone else. Sometimes the way others have done it before, and even the way we've done it before, is not the answer for the giant in this moment. Yes, God gives us experiences, and we ought to learn from them. But there are times when we need to be open to some sanctified imagination, rather than getting bogged down with the line, we've never done it that way before. Why is it we read verses in the Bible like, remember not the former things, nor consider the things of old. Behold, God says, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? And at times as Christians and at times as a church, we say, God, do a new thing among us. Just make sure it looks the old way. Just make sure we do it the same way we did it before, and that in the end it looks the same way to us. Sometimes we need some sanctified imagination. Sometimes we're more attached to our methodologies than we are open to the workings of the Spirit of God within our lives and churches. And too often our methodologies are more of a reflection of the ways of this world than the heart of God. Conventional wisdom. David, you need this armor. This is the way it's done. But instead, with 5 smooth stones, he walked onto the field, and he only needed one, for the battle was the Lord's. I'd like to spend a whole sermon just on that one point, but we've run out of time. David and Goliath is a story of courage and faith. The underdog with God against a seemingly insurmountable Goliath, who had the rest of the people of God running in fear. When David ran onto the field, the battle was over. David ran onto the field. The battle was already over, even before he threw the first stone. It was the obstacles he faced before getting there. Sometimes you and I never make it to the field of God's activity when we don't get past the obstacles of facing a giant. The obstacle of intimidation, the only giant in my life is God. The obstacle of criticism, are you wasting your time on lesser battles that you ought to turn away from? The obstacle of questionability. You are not able. Doesn't matter. God is able. And that's what matters. The obstacle of you're doing it wrong. Sometimes God wants us to face Goliath with some sanctified imagination, rather than trying, as Jesus described it, to put new wine in old wineskins and discover that it doesn't work. What obstacles might be keeping you from getting onto the field in these days? What obstacles are going on in your life right now that might be keeping you from getting onto the field in these days? But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, and the whole world will know that there is a God in our land. The only giant in my life is God. Who is the giant in your life? And what will you do when he calls you to the field with Goliath? Amen.